Good evening, friends. I am Father Ed Mazik, the rector of St. Vincent Seminary, and in the name of the entire St. Vincent Benedictine community, the seminary, the college, the Archabbey, it is my pleasure and my honor to welcome all of you to the annual Pope Benedict XVI lecture given this year by Professor Matthew Ramage, a distinguished scholar whom we are delighted to welcome to our campus here at St. Vincent for the very first time. A special word of welcome and gratitude goes to Bishop Larry Kulik, the Bishop of the Diocese of Greensburg, who joins us this evening for this lecture. Thank you, Bishop Kulik, for your leadership in the diocese, for your support for the Catholic Church and her evangelization efforts here in the Diocese of Greensburg and beyond, and for all that you do for the Church. It is always a pleasure to welcome you, Bishop. Friends, before I introduce Professor Ramage, a word about the Pope Benedict XVI lecture. This lecture series was established through the generosity of the late Mr. and Mrs. John and Rodora Donahue, and the late Dr. and Mrs. George and Margaret Ann McGovern. I extend my sincere thanks to the Donahue and McGovern families for their continued support of the Pope Benedict XVI lecture series. I extend my thanks as well to Archabbot Martin Bartle, who joins us this evening, the Chancellor of St. Vincent Seminary, for his support for the Pope Benedict XVI lecture series and for the mission and vision of our seminary. Thank you, Archabbot Martin. Friends, the first Pope Benedict XVI lecture was given in the fall of 2005 by Dr. Scott Hahn of the Franciscan University of Steubenville. And since then, a broad range of speakers have engaged the St. Vincent community on topics of contemporary interest in the areas of theology, history, artistic culture, and the intersection between faith and public life, and between faith and science. Tonight's lecture by Professor Ramage continues that rich tradition of intellectual exploration of faith and reason, and it is entitled Science, Sin, and Suffering, Joseph Ratzinger on Human Origins and the Fall. Dr. Ramage was educated first at the University of Illinois, later at the Pontifical Lateran University in Rome, at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, and at Ave Maria University in Florida, where he received his doctorate in theology. Dr. Ramage then taught at his alma mater, the University of Illinois, before taking up his current role as professor of theology at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas, a school which was founded from St. Vincent in 1857. Dr. Ramage has been the author, contributing author, or translator of more than 20 books, and is known for his research and writing on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, also known, of course, as Pope Benedict XVI. His books include Dark Passages of the Scriptures, Engaging the Bible with Pope Benedict XVI and St. Thomas Aquinas, The Experiment of Faith, Pope Benedict XVI on Living the Theological Virtues in a Secular Age, and more recently, From the Dust of the Earth, Benedict XVI the Bible, and the theory of evolution, among numerous other books and academic peer-reviewed articles. Friends in Christ, please join me in welcoming to St. Vincent, Dr. Matthew Ramage.
Thanks so much, Father Ed, and for everyone being here. It's such a blessing. Since I was at Steubenville in 2005, I've always heard such great things about St. Vincent's. And then I arrived at Benedict in college, and my understanding of the history is that you all here, back in the 1800s, called us the Kansas monks, because Father Henry Lemke essentially ran away to Kansas to evangelize while Abbot Boniface Wimmer was in Germany. That's my understanding of our origin anyway. I'm glad to be here. It's a beautiful, great time of the year, and like Father Ed said, our topic centers on a captivating subject. It's one that I receive questions about week in, week out. It's the one students knock on my office door the most about, sometimes a little bit disturbingly so because I'm not even talking about it, but they've been hearing people on the internet about it, and they need to have some clarification. So, in a word, it concerns an apparent contradiction between the world as we know it now, that has been red in tooth and claw for over 3 billion years with death and suffering, and yet, at least by most of the faithful's assumption, human sin was the catalyst of death in the world, and there's biblical evidence toward that. So how would we reconcile these? And I will warn you, if I look like I turn a lot of pages, I print in 24-point font because I only have one eye that works, so don't be too scared. So can the evolutionary story about suffering and death be reconciled with a God who is love? So we'll be developing insights from Pope Benedict and before he was Pope as Joseph Ratzinger, looking to Christ as the true Adam who reveals man to himself, especially through his paschal mystery, his cross, death, and resurrection. And what I want to propose with him is that to see suffering and death throughout history as the divinely ordained means of the love of God made manifest, that suffering that's constitutive of our life's history on earth is something not to be ashamed of, but something by which we are conformed to the cross of Christ. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it bears no fruit. So let's start with putting the last Adam first. If we look at the New Testament, Christ is the second Adam, the last Adam. Ratzinger calls him even the counter-Adam. He is the index for what it means to be a person. Ratzinger, as a professor, said, from the standpoint of Christian faith, we could say that even though Christ came late in history, he's ontologically in being at the beginning. What does he mean by calling Christ the final human being? This is where St. John's Gospel comes in. Pilate, in a classic case of Johannine irony, says, "Ecce homo," behold the man. Pilate didn't realize it, but the divine author of Scripture sure did. That Pilate, with the crucified Christ, is portraying what it means to be man. As Hebrews 5 has it, to attain perfection through suffering. So in light of this, Ratzinger says, Christology is anthropology. Christ reveals man to himself, as Vatican II says. The ineluctable nature of the call to find holiness through suffering is evident to us every day living in this fallen world. It's a fact of evolutionary biology, and to be sure, it can be difficult to square with what we know about original sin. So we want to dig down into how Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, addresses this. So the young Professor Ratzinger, whom they called the Wunderkid, the Wonder Kid, was the most renowned teacher in Germany, they say at the time. His lecture notes were distributed throughout the country. And what you'll see here is that, as the Catechism says about the early chapters of Genesis, it must be interpreted in a figurative key, a mythopoetic key. The literal sense for him, the author intention, is not to recount a piece of empirical history and thus expand our knowledge of history into the prehistoric, but to express the difference between the God-willed meaning of man and the actual existing being man. So let's just give what his view of death related to the fall is. On the day you eat it, you will die. But as Satan tells them, you won't die, and they didn't physically die, right? But they do get exiled from Eden, and that exile is a death sentence. Ratzinger says, this does not mean physical dying, but that dying must have another meaning: separation from God, alienation. He says something similar as a council expert, a peritus, at Vatican II. On Gaudium et Spes 18, Father Ratzinger remarks that the document's authors rejected a number of proposals to mention more detail on the preternatural gifts, what it would have looked like without sin. They stuck to the very basics. And while he agreed with this, he expressed some regret that the council punted on a major difficulty. Namely, this is a quote, "The thesis that man would have been immune from death had he not sinned, in its classical formulation, is scarcely intelligible to present-day thought. But it could be made intelligible by means of an existential analysis of human life." So let's think through what that means. It's clear that Ratzinger wants to avoid pigeonholing the doctrine of original sin into so close a connection with physical death that it contradicts what we know through modern science. So, like his predecessor, John Paul, he prefers a personalist approach here that endeavors to get down to the essence of what it is about death that really troubles man. And here he gives us three words: dread, absurdity, and rebellion. And I'll give you Aquinas' three words, because I always like to put these two in dialogue, the ancients and the moderns. Aquinas, sorrow, guilt, and misery is what bothers us the most about death. So why do we have suffering and death in this world? Let's look at what Pope Benedict says. He thinks that they play an indispensable role in conforming our lives with Christ crucified and risen. And in light of that, this is my wording, you could speak on his view of a world that was always intended to be cruciform, cross-shaped, or paschal, structured according to the pattern of Christ suffering, death, and resurrection. To affirm that creation has a paschal structure is to take Christ's incarnation as the key to interpreting reality. To rejoice in God having modeled creation, as Scripture tells us, after Christ. Colossians 1:15, he is the Logos who bears the meaning of creation and man within himself. If this is the case, it stands to reason that the experience of redemptive suffering that characterized the final Adam's entirely earthly existence is at the heart of the Christian vocation as such. Here's a book recommendation that came out last year. Ignatius published a little book called, well, now I'm going to forget it, but I'm going to give you the other book. It's called In the Beginning, 4 homilies by Pope Benedict. The other one, whose name is escaping me at the moment, is a variation on that book. It's called The Divine Project. And it's a series of 1985 lectures he gave. He takes John 12:24 as the key. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. This is what's happening outside right now. We have this momentary burst of glory, especially right here in Pennsylvania, these trees on campus, on the Abbey land. It's unbelievable. But pretty soon things are about to die, and necessarily so. Ratzinger takes this to be a fundamental law of creation, the Paschal mystery, the mystery of the dying grain of wheat, he says, is among the very ideas in God's creation. Man must become with Christ a grain of dead wheat to truly rise up. And that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. I'm a fan of Fulton Sheen. I'm from Illinois, and he's from the Diocese of Peoria, or at least was in Peoria. And Fulton Sheen has a wonderful quote on this. He says, "This is the law of immolation. Creation's cadence is catabolic," says Sheen. "It inevitably involves things breaking down to release energy. Yet when a creature dies," the venerable bishop explained, "the being so consumed enjoys the privilege of being, quote, transformed and elevated, reborn and ennobled into a higher life." I've also been into the church fathers on this, and I could quote 20 fathers probably, but I'll give you St. Cyril of Jerusalem with his famous 4th century catechetical lectures. He instructs the faithful to look to the analogy of nature and behold the mystery of Christ's death and resurrection, embedded in the grain sown that rises again, the felled tree that blossoms anew, the transformation of decay into verdant growth, winter freezes that make possible new life in spring, and human mortality that is the gateway to immortality. Inspired by the saints, it's not difficult to make this our own meditation, to think of it interesting in concrete ways. I like to compost. I have a little orchard that mostly fails, but I get some apples and peaches and pears and whatnot. And when you compost, we know that the decomposition of living creatures is necessary for the formation of nutrient-rich soil that teems with life. I won't go too in-depth. We could also even think of things like excrement from animals. We don't want to deal with that, but as farmers know, it's life-giving. Like the truth of the gospel, the processes at work here are counterintuitive, slow, and even unsightly at first. They're transformative. Time, heat, the activity of countless microbes combine, and we generate a magical and indispensable substance. A similar dynamic is at play in some of the Earth's most intriguing creatures. Take the caterpillar. It must digest itself, dissolving all its tissues into protein soup in order to emerge a glorious butterfly. Like the seed that breaks apart in the bowels of the earth, a caterpillar's dramatic metamorphosis is an indicator, however analogical it may be, of the cruciform structure of creation, the pivotal role that death plays in the transmission of life. I'm teaching a course on spiritual theology to my diocese's permanent diaconate candidates next weekend, and I was just rereading Teresa of Avila this week, who looks to the caterpillar on this very point. "There must be a cross while we live," she says, "and like the caterpillar, we must learn to be dead to the world, to rise from this vale of tears as an elegant, pure white butterfly." So St. Paul, again with his agricultural analogy in 1 Corinthians, says that our bodies are sown a physical body, they're raised a spiritual body. But back to Ratzinger. This cosmic vision traces all the way back to his time as a professor. He taught a number of courses on creation, Schöpfungslehre, and a priest and I in Rome are working to translate these into English. They're quite amazing, and here are a couple of lines. Professor Ratzinger said, "Suffering and death are not peripheral, but belong to the foundational or structuring principles of the world, and that whoever wanted to take suffering away would dissolve the world as such." Given that we now know suffering and death have always been integral ingredients in the evolution of life, Ratzinger cautions against insisting that human beings were initially exempt from this experience. This is where he differs from, say, Thomas Aquinas. In his courses on creation, we find him stating that the church's teaching, quote, does not include the thesis that there was no earthly death without sin. Indeed, he adds that these are as indispensable to man as suffering to the world. Another favorite document of mine on this is John Paul II's letter on suffering, Salvifici Doloris. And he takes this approach as well. Here's a quote from John Paul. "Material beings, among them also the human body, are corruptible and subject to death. It must be said that it belongs to the very structure, la stessa struttura, of these creatures' being. Yet, when it comes to moral evil," John Paul continues, "this evil with all its consequences, God definitely and absolutely does not will." Significantly, the Polish pontiff remarks, "Suffering is certainly part of the mystery of man," then adding this interesting twist. "Suffering stems from our finitude as well as our transcendence, a sign that we are destined to transcend ourselves." I think it's very important that this is not just the teaching of a few modern popes. As a lover of the ressourcement, the retrieval of the ancient sources, allow me to give you some thoughts from Augustine. Benedict was a committed Augustinian and was therefore well acquainted with the Doctor of Grace's stress on how sin clouds our ability to behold God's wisdom in the created order. So Augustine says that sickness leads the afflicted man to find healthy bread distasteful and sore eyes to perceive light as repugnant. Augustine thus maintains that creatures like the poisonous viper and the worm that causes rot have always exhibited the traits that we find repugnant. In the City of God, Augustine explains that our inability to perceive this is self-inflicted. Here's a long quote from Augustine. "It is in fact the very law of transitory things that here on earth, where such things are at home, some are born while others die. The weak give way to the strong, victims nourish the life of the victors." He continues, "If the beauty of this order fails to delight us, it is because we ourselves are so enmeshed in this corner of the cosmos that we fail to perceive the beauty of the total pattern, blended into harmony and beauty." For his part, St. Thomas Aquinas offers the predatory nature of lions and falcons to illustrate this point. The life of a lion or a falcon would not be preserved unless the ass were killed. For Thomas, God and nature make what is best in the whole, but not necessarily best in every single part, except in ordination toward the whole. It belongs to his providence to permit certain defects and over the overall good of the universe may ensue. In fact, if all evil were prevented, much good would be absent. So I'm thinking applying this what we know today. Volcanoes, earthquakes, meteorites, mass extinction events, they are all destructive. Yet if we follow St. Thomas and Ratzinger, in the grand scheme of things, these are part of God's plan for the growth of life. It is said the grapes must suffer to yield good wine. And of course, we know at the beginning of our universe, as a Catholic priest himself discovered, it all began with a big bang. But let's come back down to earth. Think about it. The sweetness of many things we find delectable is due to bitter elements. A sweet beer that comes from bitter hops, savory bread that requires sharp salt and foul-smelling yeast. More fundamentally still, and with Eucharistic overtones, bread comes from grain that is ground. Wine comes from grapes that are crushed. In some way, suffering and pain of all kinds are the raw ingredients of a rich and holy life, though certainly not desirable for themselves. The Church's spiritual tradition tells us that being ground and crushed is the means by which God mysteriously transforms us into something altogether new and glorious. Now, what I've just said of Ratzinger was from his professor days, and then we had Augustine and Aquinas. What's even more telling is that Benedict continued to speak along these lines during his time as Pope, and indeed afterwards, but we won't get into that. He kept writing, as I was delighted to eventually learn. He says that suffering stems partly from the mass of sin which has accumulated over the course of history. In Spe Salvi, his encyclical on hope, he adds, "It continues to grow unabated today, and none of us is capable of eliminating it, partly because it stems in part from our own finitude. We're unable to shake this off." In other words, a certain pain inevitably results, on Benedict's view, from being a finite creature, yet modeled after the image of the triune God whose nature can't change or suffer. Called to divinization, yet made of dust. While suffering is inevitable in this vale of tears, believers look forward to that state where God will indeed wipe away every tear from our eyes. So Benedict says that despite the fact that we don't want to die, quote, "Neither do we want to continue living here indefinitely, and nor was the earth created with that in view." To continue living forever, he continues, would appear more like a curse than a gift, more of a burden than a blessing. Not only did Benedict consider suffering integral to our universe, a remarkable further feature of his approach is that he went so far as to speak of suffering and death as necessary for our flourishing. Professor Ratzinger said that a person without suffering would be a monster. Suffering and death are essential, wesentlich, to the structure of things. Of course, in eschatology, he writes, suffering can and should be reduced, but the will to do away with it completely would mean a ban on love and the abolition of man. Suffering makes us more human. Well, a good way to get to know Ratzinger is to read his interviews. One of my favorite interview books is called God and the World, in which he lets Peter Seewald ask him questions on every topic imaginable, it seems. Listen to this quote. He asked him about suffering, and Cardinal Ratzinger replied, "Pain is part of being human. Anyone who really wanted to get rid of suffering would have to get rid of love, because there can be no love, Liebe, without suffering, Leiden. Suffering is the process through which we mature. Anyone who has inwardly accepted suffering becomes more mature in understanding of others, becomes more human. Anyone who has consistently avoided suffering does not understand other people." It turns out then that in Benedict's view, suffering is the inner side of love, and if he is correct about this, the relationship of suffering and love, I think it sheds important insight into God's will to create life by means of evolutionary processes. For if man is to be truly conformed to the image of the crucified and risen Christ, we too must ourselves be given away in a sincere gift of self through suffering and death. This appears to be the case not merely because of sin, but also because of the finite nature of our existence, and that we are meant to conform ourselves to Jesus, to the true Adam, and to thereby share in the life of the Trinity itself. So for the clergy and seminarians here tonight, you might appreciate this one. Benedict was having an audience with Italian clergy, and he had just affirmed that the world is the reflection of creative reason, as opposed to the mere product of blind evolution, as atheistic biologists sometimes will say. Benedict continues, in suffering, there's a profound meaning. And only if we give meaning to pain and suffering can our life mature. I would say, above all, there can be no love without suffering. Non è possibile l'amore senza il dolore. No gift of life without pain, because love always implies renouncement of myself. The inseparability of love and suffering, love and God, are elements that must enter into the modern conscience to help us live. I do not know whether he was aware of the following or not, but I was reading Saint Bernadette last year, and listen to what she says. Here below, love without suffering does not exist, for divine love does not exist without suffering. To capture it in what I think is a winsome and concise way, theosis, divinization, is only possible through kenosis, self-emptying, which takes the shape of Christosis, being conformed to Christ in all things. To go back to Benedict, another encyclical of his first, Deus Caritas Est, on love, is tremendous. Of course, God is agape. He is self-gift. But Benedict, following what I understand to be presumably a Neoplatonic sort of pseudo-Dionysian interpretation, also affirms that God is eros, yearning, suffering love, that this may be attributed to God in some way, while necessarily, I would argue, indicating that God and his divine nature can't change. We are beings of word and love, beings moving toward another, he says, oriented towards giving themselves to the other, and truly receiving themselves back in self-giving. God suffers with us, and the Trinity is a logic of self-giving. This logic of self-gift in the Trinity is written into creation and the hearts of men. From here, he offers what in my life I have found as sage pastoral advice. With having lupus for the last 22 years, there's always a surgery to be done, a body part to be changed out, these sorts of things. And he says it's not by sidestepping or fleeing from suffering that we are healed, but rather by our capacity for accepting it, maturing through it, finding meaning through union with Christ, who suffered with infinite love. And if we do this, suffering without ceasing to be suffering, despite everything, becomes a hymn of praise. He doesn't cite this, but I'm thinking of the souls in the Purgatorio of Dante who are suffering immensely, yet chanting with joy. Through this lens, we can come to see how evolutionary theory works not against, but indeed in concert with, the Christian understanding of divine goodness. It's often said you can't believe in God because evolution. But Benedict's perspective allows us to appreciate that the raw, bitter ingredients of evolutionary history, and indeed our present suffering, are crucial elements in the recipe for our holiness. And what our current Holy Father says is also profound. Pope Francis remarks that on this subject, many of the things we think of as evils, dangers, and sources of suffering are in reality part of the pains of childbirth, which he uses to draw us into the act of cooperation with the Creator. So I have a couple of main sections I want to go through, and the way I'm going to start to draw this in toward the culmination is by turning from Christ to Mary. It's hard to go wrong with that. I'm thinking of Vatican II on the Church, where the document culminates in Mary, where John Paul II's encyclicals so often culminate in Mariology. Mary was sinless, yet she was sorrowful. As Christians know well, the cross of Christ reveals that vicarious suffering, even death, can coexist with sinlessness. Jesus' earthly life gives us the perfect picture of what this looks like without a fall. While it still would not have been a desirable experience for its own sake, suffering nevertheless could have been the occasion for a synergy of wills in which man handed himself over to God, saying, "Not my will, but thine be done." Now, that being said, Christ is not the only individual we Catholics know was sinless. Ratzinger taught a Mariology class one time I have the notes for. Father Emery de Gaulle is a great Ratzinger scholar who has written on this. And then, of course, Ratzinger published some Mary texts. And I want to share with you a few insights from those. See, Mary, being a mere creature, gives us a glimpse in what suffering might have looked like in a mere creature who was unfallen back before the incarnation even. It is no surprise that a Catholic theologian like Ratzinger holds that Mary experienced a great deal of suffering and sorrow. After all, one of her titles is Our Sorrowful Mother. And indeed, St. Simeon prophesied to her at Jesus' presentation that a sword will pierce your own soul. Because of this, the fact that suffering and sinlessness coexisted in the earthly life of Mary is so clear as to perhaps appear trivial. What is not so obvious to many today is something else that Ratzinger holds regarding the Blessed Virgin. While many believers today, understandably, I was once of this position, I assumed Mary was taken to heaven without death. That's actually a relatively recent view that's never been formally taught by the magisterium. Ratzinger follows the more ancient patristic view that the Blessed Virgin died before her dormition. As Ratzinger explains, what distinguishes Mary's suffering and death from the way the rest of us confront these enigmas is that she made the perfect choice when it came to how she would respond to this cross, with the help of the grace God has given her, receiving suffering and her death as a gift that leads to greater conformity with her Son. Ratzinger thus taught in his Mariology class that the Blessed Virgin's death, if she died, was not merely a passive affair, but the active bursting forth of love and a final grand fiat. Mary's death, he says, is not the result of sin, but the self-giving away of love, the overwhelming power of love. And he here makes a crucial distinction between biological death and ultimate existential death. Sometimes we distinguish based upon the Greek, the bios, the biological, and the zoe, the higher ordered life. As St. Francis of Assisi says, sister bodily death ought to be embraced, as every creature must eventually pass through her doors. Spiritual or existential death, mortal sin, on the other hand, is something we bring upon ourselves when we fail to live our life like God intends and as if we were self-sufficient. The reverse side of this, the good news, is that this more important death can be conquered even as we meet our bodily demise and shuffle off this mortal coil. Death, says Ratzinger, can be absent even if the somatic end, the bodily end, is present. This is what he sees happening in the case of Mary. She suffered and died like the rest of us, with the crucial difference lying in her response to the trial. She did not experience death as an evil to be dreaded, much less as evidence against God, but rather as the definitive path to conformity with Jesus. Our Lady knew the truth of her son's words. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both in Gehenna. Incidentally, I have not verified the historical accuracy of this. My children have these CDs of saints called Glory Stories. And the story of Blessed Imelda is that she desired to receive the Eucharist so much that the saying goes, the tradition goes, that she died upon receiving him out of love. Now, I personally don't want that to happen to my kids. But it's an example, at least from hagiography, of how this might work. So the final reflection I want to look at builds upon this. And it's having to do with what I would say from Benedict is summarized in the following words. The main problem is not having to suffer and die, but how to suffer and die well. So the passages I've just outlined clearly indicate that Ratzinger considers Mary to have died before being assumed. This, combined with the fact that he didn't even feel the need to argue for this position, confirms Ratzinger's broader understanding of how sin, suffering, and physical death fit together. In light of the above discussion, let us add that redemptive suffering and death continue to unite us still today, ourselves, with Mary and Jesus. And I would like to draw out some implications of how Ratzinger's approach to Mariology and her acceptance of suffering and death can apply in our lives. In light of Ratzinger's understanding of Mary, combined with the integral role of suffering and death in the evolutionary design of the cosmos, it seems appropriate to conclude that mankind's ultimate problem is our resistance to accepting our crosses as the path to our sanctification. It's our orientation toward our suffering, our relationship with these trials through which we must all pass. Do we play the victim card? Do we get angry at God? Do we rebel? Or do we legitimately try to use the medicine we have? Do we ask the saints' intercession? Do we do all we can? And then, if we can't solve the suffering, do we accept these as God's will for our sanctification? And I want to contrast two phenomenologies here. I'm thinking of various kinds of suffering I've had and when I bore it well and when I did not. One of the worst, I'll spare you the details about, but it was after my kidney transplant, and the doctor was doing something to me I very much didn't like, and I cussed him out. On the other hand, my wife has delivered 7 children without anesthesia and never did what the movies say. She never cussed the doctor out. I'm not saying she was perfect, but I can say she did about 99.9% better than I would have. She was living by the grace of Christ. Sometimes I do. Either way, the grace of Christ is what allows us to suffer and die well, with Christ and his Blessed Mother in a cruciform gift of self-abandonment to the Father's will. Ratzinger's vision is one of a human race that has likely always experienced suffering of some kind. C.S. Lewis even speaks to this. He says that even in paradise, I've supposed a minimal amount of self-adherence to overcome, a self-surrender. But it would have been sublime. I compare this to, I used to be able to run, the runner's high, or the Olympian. He doesn't achieve glory and appreciate his glory despite the pain, it's because of the pain. But one of the differences I understand between purgatory and hell is that hell has no terminus to the pain. Purgatory has a telos to it. Now, this I would see as the key if we look backwards. Even if our first parents suffered physical pain and trials before their fall, it would not have been misery and despair. St. Thomas Aquinas speaks along the same lines. I want to add a few thoughts from him. In his Mariology, like the fathers who preceded him, he held that she died before being assumed. And he then addresses the question of why. Why didn't Christ just bring her straight to heaven? And here's his direct verbatim answer. In order that the Blessed Virgin might be conformed to her Son, she was not freed from death. As for Benedict, so for the angelic doctor, it's all about conformity to Christ. And relevant to this point, Thomas adds another angle in the context of this question as to why, upon baptism, we don't go straight to heaven. St. Thomas says it's because our trials are suitable for spiritual training, to make us instrumental causes of our own redemption, and to thereby receive the crown of glory. Indeed, he says we did not receive an immortal, impassible body after baptism, so that we might suffer with Christ, so as to be glorified with him. Citing Romans 8:17. And relatedly, one final point on Aquinas related to Pope Benedict. I was blown away when some years ago I was at the Angelicum in Rome and a priest gave a paper in which he commented from a lesser known text of Thomas that man was not destined to live on this earth forever, but was destined to be transferred to heaven. Man was never meant to live here forever. Now, whether you call that death or a transitus like St. Francis, I'm thinking St. Benedict in some ways here, what would that have looked like? It's a fascinating question. My hunch is that it would have looked a lot like the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin. So to conclude, we've drawn on the rich wellspring of wisdom from the Catholic tradition, Scripture, some fathers, Aquinas, especially Pope Benedict, and the approach I've sketched invites us to see our trials in life from a fresh perspective. As Benedict would have it, suffering of all kinds should be understood less as absolute evil and more as variations upon a musical theme, temporary dissonance, minor chords that contribute to the all-surpassing beauty of the perfect symphony that is creation. Viewed in light of the gospel, the realities of suffering and death that have always been part of earth have been allowed by God to make room for love. And as I have contended, this vantage point allows us to see that the very imperfection of our evolving world is precisely what conforms us creatures to the cross of Christ. Yet ultimately, it must be acknowledged that our knowledge of the events that transpired at the origin of human history is limited. Ratzinger himself said, "The empirical history is sealed just like the cherubim with the flaming sword block Eden." Lacking direct experience and the ability to demonstrate what a world without sin would have looked like, I've merely endeavored to propose Ratzinger's thought as an eminently fitting way to think through the relationship between sin, science, suffering, and death. In my experience, it's becoming increasingly important that we propose models. Despite our different theological proclivities, we must once again learn to take a page from Thomas Aquinas' wise saying, that there are some things that must be believed by the faithful. In other cases, there's latitude for debate, and in such matters, even the saints may at times disagree. This is one of those topics where we see this lived out. And I would add with St. Augustine, the doctor of grace, we should be seeking unity in essentials, freedom in doubtful matters, and in all things, charity. My hope is that this lecture has cast fresh light on this profound mystery of suffering, science, death, love, and that it will serve to strengthen the bonds of charity among the faithful here at St. Vincent's. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramage. Dr. Ramage has said he will be very happy to take questions and respond to the concerns and thoughts that any of you may wish to bring forward. There's a microphone in the center aisle, so please, this is a great opportunity to pose serious problems and questions that touch upon each of our spiritual lives to someone who has really devoted his life to investigating these matters in the name of our church and of our faith. So please feel free to ask questions or offer comments.
Yes, I would welcome anything, so feel free. My kidney's still working, so go ahead.
Doctor, thank you for your presentation, especially beautiful words and a great homage to Pope Benedict, a personal hero of mine, so thank you very much. I'm wondering, when you were speaking earlier in your lecture presentation about maybe more positive sufferings like a meteor or a volcano, it made me think about maybe more negative sufferings. For example, longing, unfulfilled desire.
Yeah.
As you were discussing a prelapsarian concept of suffering, it made me think of Adam. And when God says, it's not good for the man to be alone, I will make a helper for him. And then he proceeds to make cattle and animals, which kind of seems out of place. Then when he makes woman, Adam says, this one at last, almost like a longing has been fulfilled, suggesting that before that, he had a desire that had not yet been met.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you have any words for us, either your own or from Pope Benedict, or both, about how to understand suffering as longing and a yearning.
Yeah.
And if you can go even further, how do we understand that in the person of Christ?
Definitely the first part I can speak to. When I start to get into hypotheticals on Christology, there's probably heresy lurking somewhere there. So I like to tell my undergrads, if you talk for more than 5 minutes about the Trinity, there's probably a heresy somewhere there. But yeah, as far as the yearning goes, I've been meditating upon this just the past couple days especially. I think it was a C.S. Lewis quote I came across. Yeah, now I know what it was. It was a C.S. Lewis quote from The Problem of Pain, and it was in a book I was peer reviewing. But he was talking about how we all have this nostalgia, another name he was giving for the longing. And my experience, I think he's right that this longing points to heaven, that the only real resolution has to be in heaven. And so Pope Benedict actually, in the encyclical Spe Salvi, he says that the unfulfilled longings we have are the best rational only, that is, argument from reason alone, evidence for heaven. Of course, heaven is a datum of faith. It's not irrational. but it's supra-rational. But he actually argues along the lines of Aristotle's argument from desire, right? We all desire water, ergo water exists. You may not get water, you may die of thirst, but water exists or else the hunger makes no sense. Same thing with food, sex, etc. And Benedict, along the lines of that argumentation, says we all have this desire for justice, and that not just justice, but fulfillment that's not met. And in a very Augustinian key, it's that notion that the heart is restless till it rests in God. I really like that as evidence pointing towards a future fulfillment, that we all necessarily are limited. Another thing that C.S. Lewis says in this line I was reading on the plane was, each of us has something about our lives we love, and we can't fully explain it to someone else. He mentions a guy doing woodworking in a shop, the smell of the wood. For me, maybe it's Ratzinger's scholarship or the Bible. People can't understand, or I get obsessed about fossils. Everywhere I go, I try to find fossils. But there's something in that I'm looking for of the infinite. Now, with Christ's yearning, yeah, I had better punt on that. If you want to ask me afterwards and get more precise, maybe I'll have something coherent to say, but otherwise, probably not. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. What would you say to an 80-year-old college professor who has a friend who lived in Oregon, whose life was a shambles and recently committed assisted euthanasia, and he just thinks that's fine?
Yeah.
How would you address that?
Yeah, that the person whose friend or family member committed it and thinks it's fine. Yeah, I mean, ultimately the problem of evil like this goes back from time immemorial. My thought on this matter is, first of all, I try to empathize with people and say, if I've not been in this situation, hey, I hear you, I'm here for you, and words I won't say in church, but that stinks. That sort of message to, like, Job's friends started with Job really well. They just sat with him in the sackcloth and ashes, and then they start trying to explain too much to Job. And that's where they start to go wrong. You want to continue, though? Are you going to say something else, too?
No. Did I tell you that the friend is an atheist?
So
Job isn't going to persuade him.
Yeah.
Neither is Benedict or any of the Ratzinger. None of those people.
Yeah. So my first thought on the atheist portion is the only thing in my experience, unsuccessful as I usually am, is that love is the only convincing thing. Certainly we want to sound rational and we want to be coherent. And again, here, as always, I have some thought from Pope Benedict. He thinks the two greatest proofs, apologiae for the faith, are the beauty of the church and the holiness living it. And if I can't get a person to live it in some limited way, to try to see their suffering redemptively, I find it very, very challenging. I'm reminded in my personal experience, I was in a Roman hospital for 5 weeks in 2003, couldn't move my body, I was practically dying, all these sorts of things. And I had a guy who was an atheist, obviously former Catholic, he was Italian, and he was angry at God, didn't think God existed, and he would come up to me laid up in a bed and just cuss me out. And it was when we invaded Iraq for the second time, and he used to call me Bush as a derogatory statement, and then the space shuttle blew up and all these things were happening. And all I could do was sit there and listen to him and tell him, I know you don't really believe in this, but I'm gonna pray for you, brother. And that's the start of my thought process on that. Thank you, though.
Dr. Ramage, thank you very much for your thoughtful lecture. If the law of immolation exists throughout creation, you'll have to forgive me for forgetting the source, but there's some psychologist who cited that the impact of trauma is less about the nature of the trauma as it is the degree to which we experience communion in that trauma. Is there a way that you can connect the destination of, at least for human beings, our suffering to be an experience of communion
I think
with
so.
God throughout the rest of creation?
I think so. Yeah, that was a Fulton Sheen quote. So first thought on that is, yes, I don't know the psychological literature, but it rings true to my own experience and of other people I know who've suffered. I'm thinking of, we have an encyclopedia of Catholic theology. It's going to be a new free resource some of us are working on, and I have one on theodicy in the Bible I was asked to write. And all the different books, the wisdom books especially, but one of the things that gets brought up that I think is beautiful is Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes has got to be the darkest book in the Bible. And why is a book in there where the guy denies the afterlife and says there's no answers and justice pays the same as injustice? And once upon a time, I came across a commentator that I still take as a pearl of wisdom. And he said, clearly, countless thousands of people throughout history have found consolation that God deemed it fit to include this book in the Bible of a guy who had basically lost hope. And same thing with Job. Job kind of waffles between hope and despair. And then the psalmist is constantly, all of you who pray the liturgy multiple times a day know better than I, but he's constantly complaining to God and telling God he abandoned him, and that God decides to sanctify that. The second part of your great question I think you were getting to was, I think you mentioned creation. And my perspective in my spiritual life, I have trouble putting this into words, but let me try. I find that when I think of my lupus, whether it's heart surgery, people cutting open your chest, cutting open your kidneys, cutting your eye, whatever it is, certainly Adam's sin had drastic consequences. But if I think of that physical suffering only is in the world because of Adam, to me that's personally, and I can only speak personally, less moving than looking at Christ wrote the universe with the law of the grain of wheat in it, and that I'm actually participating in the cosmic mystery of Christ. So I kind of think more Eastern patristic on that, and it so happens that's Ratzinger's approach. So I kind of go back and forth then on, did I think this before Ratzinger said it, or did I think it and then Ratzinger said it? That's the mind-boggling thing about this guy, is that every time I've had something go wrong or a theological doubt, it seems like he's always had some wisdom for me. But I hope that little comment about entering into the Paschal rhythm of creation, man being the apex, has some value to your question.
Thank you so much for that very erudite talk, Professor. I'm attracted to Benedict's views about the value, perhaps the instrumental value, of suffering. But many of my colleagues back in the United Kingdom, I've talked about this, are not. And their main worry, which has been articulated quite forcefully recently by the Durham theologian Karen Kilby, is that if one places really any significant value upon suffering, it becomes very difficult to love one's neighbor without reserve. After all, one might think that loving one's neighbor just involves removing suffering from them. And yet Benedict's words seem to indicate that there was at least some limit to such a desire, at least there should be. So I wonder what you have to say about that. Should we seek to remove all suffering from other people or not? And if so, how can we love them fully?
I have a few thoughts on that. We had a dialogue about this at my college. One of my colleagues has a child with Downs, and that child is probably 30 now. And the students were scandalized when my very, very traditionally minded colleague, Thomas Aquinas College, all that, and they asked him, would you remove Downs from your child if you could go back? And he said, absolutely yes. Because the college students, I think understandably, their first reaction was, well, what about his dignity? you know? And John, being a wonderful philosopher, understood the dignity of the person is the same. And in this particular design of God's providence, he did give this gift of suffering in the form of Down syndrome to my child. But like Pope Benedict, he would say we should always reasonably try to remove suffering. So I go with Aquinas on the virtue of fortitude here, the 2 steps of fortitude. The first one being attack, the second one being endurance. So you try to remove a problem if you can, but if you can't, then it's about the clearest indication of God's will as you could possibly have, that you now have to bear the cross, and that's his gift. So does that get in the ballpark? Yeah.
Dr. Ramage, Father Romwald, I was one of your students in 2021 in prophetic literature at Holy Apostles. So
Wow,
I'm thinking about dark passages
Yeah.
and your method C interpretation for
Yeah.
biblical hermeneutics, biblical theology. Being that we're at an institution where you're going to have a lot of people going out and working in churches as priests, perhaps not ever going to school again, or people that go into DREs and never get advanced degrees.
Yeah.
Similar to what you said about after 5 minutes of talking about the Trinity, you're going to lead yourself into heresy. How do you propose to those individuals that are out in the parishes addressing the people that are suffering with these issues to keep up with the proper hermeneutic, but without lapsing into a social heresy of trying to think that you're ahead of all of these thinkers in anthropology
Yeah.
and the sciences?
If we get to shake hands afterwards, that'd be great, by the way. But real quick to follow up on that, do you mean on the science type stuff? Yeah, so here's my thought on that. There's so many good, simple resources. I'm not wedded to the Dominican approach, but I think the whole Aquinas 101 kind of videos they do, the Thomistic Institute, I think there are a lot of great videos. I like Word on Fire. I think those are things where you can go to. And for example, this Word on Fire is coming out with a book from a professor at Steubenville, a scientist, next spring on evolution, and it's very readable. And you know, my books, most of them, I have a few coming out that are more pop, but they're more geared towards monks, graduate students. My upper level students can handle them too in the undergrad level, but they're not really for the pews. But an example on this topic is Father Nicanor Austriaco of the East Coast Dominicans. He spearheaded a little book called Thomistic Evolution. I really like that text. My friend Chris Baglow at Notre Dame, their Faith and Science Initiative has put out some very nice texts. My favorite, I've used it for a high school summer week program we have. It's called Faith, Science, and Sin, Theology on the Cutting Edge or something like that. And it's not a subtitle I would have chosen, but it is a high school book put out by the Opus Dei Press Midwest Theological Forum. Anyway, I think we're really blessed and maybe even to the point of spoiled that it's increasingly becoming the case that multiple publishers are having their own versions of these things that are actually readable. So that's my thought.
Hello, Dr. Ramage. I'm Brother Romanus, monk and seminarian. I know the Catechism, paragraph 1008, says that even though man dies, God did not create or intend man to die when he created him. And it says that bodily death is the result of a consequence of sin. And Scripture often refers, or at least in several times in the New Testament, refers to death as an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
How can we maybe reconcile that paragraph of the Catechism with the whole notion that God intended us to die?
I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. That's like a couple chapters in my book. Of course, it's nice if you don't bring it up because then it's easier, right? But it's interesting. Ratzinger, of course, edited the Catechism. And I was just talking to Monsignor Swetland, who was one of the helpers on that. I don't know, for all I know, someone in this room helped as well. But what he says about that is that the Catechism and Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, they deliberately were just taking the straight traditional line because they did not want to confuse people and get into hypotheticals. So they just decided not to weigh in on it. And of course, we have people more authoritative than I in the room who could speak on this. But that's the idea that he says. So he gets into these more details about what that death might have meant, spiritual death, more in his informal statements. It'll come up in a homily even as Pope. It comes up in things he says, obviously, during his cardinalate days. But in a nutshell, his main interpretation that has a lot of warrant to it is he looks at Adam as Israel. And the death that came was Israel's death, because Adam is a microcosm. He gets the perfect land, the perfect law, everything you'd ever want. He immediately sins. He gets kicked out that very day. And the leitmotif, the running theme of the Old Testament is Israel gets a law, God rescues them, they sin immediately. Like on Mount Sinai, Exodus 32, they're already sinning simultaneously with Moses getting the law. And so then he takes more of a spiritual interpretation. But here's another option. Benedict doesn't do this. I do this in my book because I feel like it's nice to have this option that's more traditional. St. Maximus the Confessor, try this on for size. His view is that Adam's sin did in fact cause death, all death. Now, by the way, Aquinas roundly rejects this view. But Maximus's view is that Adam's sin caused everything to die, like Paul says, like Genesis implies. But God created the earth knowing Adam would do it. So in light of God's foreknowledge, that's another option out there. And I just had a conversation with a very esteemed Catholic thinker this week who was adamant to me that Maximus is right, Ratzinger's wrong, Aquinas is wrong. And I said, okay, we need to have a beer. And that's about where that ends, because we're not going to convince each other which one's right. That's where the final line in my talk, I think, is crucial, that a multitude of views really are possible here, Ratzinger shows, within the bound. And this is what this priest told me was, yeah, I recognize Aquinas' view as orthodox. I just can't get on board with everything was going to die, even though Aquinas thought man was exempt. But this is why a lot of us who are into Dominican theology are pretty sure Aquinas would have been a big fan of the discoveries of evolution, but maybe not Maximus. So it's another angle you can take. Yeah. Good? Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Oh, Doctor, thank you. Last question. Appreciate it.
Oh, no, I appreciate this talk. Thank you so much. If you, how would you characterize the effects of the fall? And especially, how would you talk about it when you're not going to maybe have sort of a time-limited fall? Thank you.
I'm sorry, could you just expand a tiny bit when you're not going to have a time-limited fall?
Yeah, so a literal interpretation of Genesis would have, right, what happens in Genesis chapter 3, which is the fall.
Yeah.
And so in this evolution perspective, there's not the fall didn't happen, the fall didn't happen, the fall happens, the effects of the fall happen.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested to hear how you describe the effects of the fall, and especially how you talk about it without this sort of fall moment, or do you?
Yeah. And I think I didn't hear the last two words, but I think I get the question. It's like for my little kids at home, we have 7 kids. I just, with little kids, I take the straight line, look, catechism, Adam would have been immortal, all that stuff. But we're big dinosaur fans. We all know dinosaurs were dying hundreds of millions of years before humans. So I kind of start with a simple pedagogy. I don't challenge my kids with too much on that. With regard to the effects in time, so I'm going to answer this in a way that might not be what you're looking for, but I want to say this because it shows literarily why Ratzinger thinks looking at physical death related to fall is a category mistake. So chapter 3 of Genesis, while often interpreted as scientific as a fall, it's in the genre that in the biblical world we call etiology. Epidemiology has etiology of diseases from the Greek haetia, or cause. Genesis deploys a lot of clever word plays. He's called Adam in perfect biblical Hebrew because he's from the Adamah, the dirt. It doesn't necessarily mean the first guy's name was Hebrew, which didn't exist yet. But in the laundry list of curses of the fall, snakes begin to not have legs. That's scientifically not what happened. Although snakes did, in fact, we know, evolve from lizards, which is funny. Nice correspondence there. It's not what all of a sudden happened. Thorns and thistles and sweat. In my book, I get very hardcore about this. I try to force people to think through it, that if we began to finally have sweat, we'd have never lived to start with. So I think the sacred author himself knew this was being used figuratively, and at some point people lose the Hebrew kind of mindset on that. Ratzinger liked to recall that the church fathers even were over 1,000 years removed from this. So that's kind of part one. And then with regard to what, I'm gonna quote my wife on this. Being more or less Thomists, we tend to think that nature has an integrity, and if God had prevented, let's say teeth, canines, did canines just start to exist after Adam's sin? We know our hominin ancestors 200,000 to 2 million years ago had canines. So how is it that there are canines if they're not eating meat, which is killing stuff? Probably the sacred author knew all of this, and we begin to make a category mistake, is what, from a biblical scholarship point of view, I would say. And then the final point I would add is that I had a young earth creationist this summer who kind of accosted me for an hour about this. And he had found a way in his mind to square Genesis and a 6,000-year-old earth with everything in Catholicism. I told him, bravo, man. But for Ratzinger, it's not doing science really at all. So if we're gonna take the curses of the fall scientifically, probably better take the geocentrism literally and the year of the age of the universe literally. But my favorite example is one almost no one comments on outside of biblical scholars, and that is Genesis assumes an agrarian setting, and humans have been around at least 200,000 years, but we've only been agricultural for 10,000 years. So that's where you don't need science to help us with these things, but the scientific discoveries actually help confirm what we know through the literary study of the sacred page that Vatican II, for example, urges us. I know it's probably more than you wanted, and maybe not even exactly what you wanted, but I think that's really important to bear in mind. But thank you all very much. I appreciate your time. God bless you.